Hey, welcome to the Push-Pull Sales and Marketing Podcast. I'm Marcello.
And I'm Sherry, and each episode will provide you with sales and marketing strategies that you can implement immediately into your own business. Today, I am speaking with Andy Cunningham, who is the founder and president of Cunningham Collective, a marketing brand and communication strategy firm dedicated to bringing innovation to market. She is also the author of Get to Aha, Discovering Your Positioning DNA and Dominate Your Competition. She's also the host of the popular podcast Marketing Over Ice. And Andy's credentials include having key roles in the launch of new tech categories and products like the Apple Macintosh. I don't think it gets any bigger than that over the past 35 years. So thank you for coming on the podcast, Andy.
Thank you for having me, Sherry. It's great to be here.
When you sent over your bio, it's very impressive always to get to read through that kind of list. And I'm sure it's not something that you necessarily think about on a day-to-day basis, but fill us in a little bit more. How have you gotten to this point? If you've been in this world for the past 35 years, I can only imagine the wealth of knowledge that you have, but, I don't know how, I'm sure there's so many little pieces, and I'm sure we'll dive in a little bit more, but what do you currently do? I guess we'll start there. And how did you get to this particular point?
Sure. Well, what I currently do is I have a marketing consulting company that's called Cunningham Collective. And what we do is we help, as you said in your introduction, we help bring innovation to market. But we do all of the marketing and communication things associated with that, which is really the core of getting traction in the market. We help companies with their positioning, with their communication strategy, with their external and internal communications. And the book that I wrote, Get to Aha, is all about the first and most important step in that whole process, which is the process of positioning your company or service in the marketplace.
Yeah, and I thought you touched on something briefly there that I thought was interesting as well throughout the book, that it's something when you're figuring out your DNA, your company's DNA, that it needs to be presented to the customers and to the market, but it's also very important that the entire company from the top down understands that DNA and is functioning under that same belief system, that same understanding. And I thought it was a really good point that so often we're looking outward and looking to the market when it needs to start at home first.
It does, and in fact, that's really the underlying premise of the book, is that companies are very much like people. Mm-hmm. They're run by people, they're founded by people, they serve people, and they have many of the same attributes as people. So I created this model around corporate DNA, which mirrors kind of human DNA, and I've got 3 categories of companies. So a human DNA is very complex, but company DNA, we simplified it to make it a much more approachable exercise. But you have to conduct a $100,000 genome test in order to figure out your company DNA. There's a little test in the book to find out whether you are a customer-oriented company, or what I call a mother, or a product-oriented company, what I call a mechanic, or a concept-oriented company, what I call a missionary. And once you understand who you actually are at the core, it is much easier to create authentic marketing against that DNA. And that's really the point about it. And in today's world, with everything being digital and everybody can find out everything about everyone, marketing absolutely has to be authentic. It has to be a reflection of who you are. And this is simply a way to figure out who you are so that you can get started with the best possible knowledge going forward.
Right. And that's a key piece of it, is you might have an idea of what you think you are, but making sure that you really narrow that down. I mean, I appreciated just the practical aspects of the book, that I could go through and take the quiz, and those answers point me, to the result was pretty much what I expected, but how dominant that result was a little bit surprising to me. And it helped me reframe for my own businesses that, like, okay, maybe if we're looking to bring a new product or a new service, or we're looking to do something new, especially as we head into 2018 here, that we need to go back to the drawing board for some of these things. Some of these things aren't going to fit our DNA. And it just serves as a North Star a little bit, that if you're ever coming to that crossroads, to go back to basics. Can you give us a little bit more of a description for each of those?
Sure. So again, the customer-oriented companies are what I call mothers, are companies who really measure their success based on their customer relationships. They hire people who are really interested in customer relationships. They structure themselves differently. They tend to structure themselves around customer segments rather than product lines. They talk about different things in meetings. They sit down in a meeting, and the first thing they'll talk about is a customer situation, a customer problem, or a customer compliment, or something like that. So those are customer companies, or what I call mothers. Product-oriented companies are companies who really are focused on building the best product on the planet. And they structure themselves against product lines, and they talk about products in meetings. And when they go to buy a company, they want to buy a company that is going to add a feature to their product platform or to their product mix as they have it. And they also measure success differently. They tend to measure success based on not customer relationships like mothers, but more on dominating a market for a certain product. And the third category, which is the missionary category, this is the most unusual category, although it is the category that everyone wants to be in. But it is the real change the world category. These companies exist to actually change human behavior on a fundamental level. And some of the ones that we are all familiar with, FedEx was a really great example of that changed behavior on a fundamental level. Starbucks changed behavior on a fundamental level. Apple, also Tesla, a number of these companies, Salesforce, have really figured out how to change behavior on a fundamental level, and that's how they measure success. So they do things very differently from the other two companies. So once you sort of take the test, you kind of have an understanding of who you are at the core, and then you can start to develop your positioning around who you are. It's almost like if you were born to be if you're Steph Curry and you were born to be a basketball player and a really great basketball player, if you started wasting your time with something else, let's say ping pong or piano lessons or something like that, and not focusing on your talent as a basketball player, you would be putting to waste that great DNA that you were born with. Mm-hmm. And that's really what we're talking about with companies.
So do you think that, to use that same terminology, do you think these companies are born with that DNA? Or do you think, like if we're looking at Starbucks or FedEx, at what point do you think that it was they discovered about themselves that they were missionaries, not just we're going to do it better, but we're going to change things? And I guess something to me, I think it's so difficult, and maybe it's because I'm not a missionary, but it's so difficult for me to picture to be able to go into it saying we're going to do things different. How
right.
Or is it just take that certain kind of person that sets out for the company, and most of the decisions then from the get-go are based on that core belief?
Yes, I would say that most of the time missionary companies are founded by a cult of personality leader, mm-hmm. who has this driving desire that cannot be squashed to change the world. Mm-hmm. Having worked with Steve Jobs, I absolutely know that's what he was. But I've met some of these other people as well, and they are very much the same way. They really are trying to change something fundamental. And, most technology companies want to change something, right? That's kind of what technology exists to do. But there's a difference between changing human behavior on a fundamental level, like the missionaries want to do, and making incremental improvements to how we do spreadsheets, for example, or how we store data, or how we interact with our computers. Those are all incremental improvements on something somebody else built. And when you finally kind of know what you are, then it's much easier to do everything else from there. But here's the thing. Usually it's the founder who sets the tone in a company like this, but sometimes it's the group of founders. If you look at the Beatles as a great example of a group of people who came together and basically created magic, each one of those people individually really didn't create that magic, but when they came together as a unit, they became a certain type of DNA, and it required all four of them in order to get there. And that is similar with companies. Sometimes it's the founder, but sometimes it's the group of people who come together and how they make decisions in the very, very early stages. And then often when a missionary leaves a company, as in the case of the unfortunate death of Steve Jobs, the company must soldier on either figuring out that it's going to try to continue to be a missionary, or oftentimes they drift over into the product category and become a mechanic. And that's really what's happening with Apple today, is they're moving from the missionary status because they lost Steve to becoming what I call a product-oriented company, or more of a mechanic. We haven't seen a next big thing come out of Apple since Steve died. And Tim Cook isn't a cult of personality leader. He's very much a great operator, and he's turning the company into a product-oriented company. I'm not sure it's intentional, but it's happening nonetheless.
And that's what I was going to say, that I don't think that in and of itself is necessarily a problem, but I feel like in a lot of the marketing and a lot of what we're being bombarded with is that they're still trying to claim that they're that missionary type, that it's still the next big thing, or that this is still changing the world. And there's that disconnect where you say, wow, that's not really what we're seeing. We are seeing incremental progress. We still love the product. We still think it's an incredible piece of design, and an incredible piece of technology, but we know what we're seeing. And I think that's where you hit home time and again in the book, is that understand what you are, because your audience on some level is understanding what you are. And whether or not they can see it for what it is, when you deviate from that DNA, something feels off. And like you touched on initially, it just feels disingenuous.
Right. It doesn't feel right. And unfortunately, this change at Apple is happening to Apple. Apple is not steering itself in that direction. I do believe there's a great opportunity for Tim Cook to steer the company proactively in the direction of a mechanic or a product-oriented company, and really focus on that in the marketing and the advertising and the customer relationships and all of that, and build better and better and better products. They've actually had some issues with their products lately, which is a problem for a company that's a product-oriented company like Apple is. If you look at Amazon, though, Amazon is actually making a very thoughtful and purposeful change in their DNA. They started off as a product-oriented company. I think Jeff Bezos was a missionary himself, but I think he structured the company as a product company. And what's happened in the recent couple of years is they're purposefully moving to what I call a mother. They're moving to a more customer-oriented company. And you can see this with a number of examples that Amazon has done purposefully. The first one being the acquisition of Zappos. Mm-hmm. Zappos, as we all know, was run by Tony Hsieh, who was Mr. Customer Satisfaction. He wrote a book called Delivering Happiness. Mm-hmm. And Amazon bought Zappos not because Amazon couldn't figure out how to sell shoes online, but because Amazon wanted that culture of customer centricity. And if you look at online at their mission statement today, they have a new mission at Amazon, and it is now to become Earth's most customer-centric company. So they're purposefully steering the company in that direction, whereas Apple is being pushed by circumstances in the market, including Steve's death.
Yeah. Well, but the interesting thing about Amazon then is that if they're positioning themselves as a mother, but I feel like, at least for me, I see them as a missionary organization, that they have changed. They've changed my life on a very fundamental level. I don't go to the store anymore. And where does that kind of cross paths? Has that been a side effect of focusing on the product first and then switching? Like, how much do they play into each other?
Well, I think, like I said, I do believe that Jeff himself is a missionary, but I think he has structured things and organized his company and led the company in a much more practical, pragmatic way. So I don't believe that Amazon is a missionary company. I really believe that they're moving to become a customer-oriented company. And the reason is this. What is happening there is he has taken this strategy of taking what I call eating the universe one bite at a time. So instead of trying to go out and cure cancer or, push out all the IBM computers and replace them with Macs, which is what Steve Jobs wanted to do, or create, put people in rocket ships heading to Mars, and colonizing Mars like Elon Musk wants to do. Jeff Bezos never went out and said anything like that. He never had that giant vision statement. He just takes one little thing at a time, and he plays off of what's already happening in the market. Mm-hmm. So the first thing he did was he basically said, we're going to be an online bookseller. There's already booksellers. We're not changing anything dramatic here. We're just going to do it online. and then it went to, music, and then it went to, and pretty soon now it's everything.
Yeah.
But that's Jeff Bezos is running that company in a very, very methodic, step-by-step, practical, pragmatic way. Not to say that he's going to eat the universe one bite at a time, but simply to do it but run the company today more like a customer-focused company. So it's a strategy question, and I think that he's chosen the strategy of a pragmatic strategy rather than a let's colonize Mars strategy.
Yeah, and I think that gives some clarity to it for sure. And it also, what popped into my head is that, right, none of them, there can be successful companies that are mothers, that are mechanics, that are missionaries, that so often we get caught up in the glitz and the glamour and the change the world mentality when there is so much value in each of these strategies, and that all of them can be successful.
Absolutely. Yeah, and they are. There are many great companies based on all three of those DNAs.
Yeah. Do you have any other examples of the mother types or the mechanic types that are some of your favorites?
Sure. So one of my favorite mother companies is Lyft. I think that's a great company. And of course, we especially in the face of what's been going on at Uber, they are just leveraging the heck out of their motherhood, mm-hmm. and really, I think earning themselves a bigger position in the market as a result of it. Of course, we all love Nordstrom. They're a huge mother. They love the notion of serving customers and making customers feel very much at home. I think McKinsey is another example in the service space of that. Mm-hmm. If you look at the more on the mechanic side, Oracle is a great mechanic. Microsoft, this is another great example. Microsoft and the new CEO are really doubling down on their mechanic status and doing a better and better and better job of building products, which I really love. I love that he's looked at who they are and he's just making them much better at it. And Walmart is a great example of a mechanic company. They are very much focused on the product that they're delivering, not the products they sell, but the product that they deliver, and it's a replicable model all over the place. And what they focus on is value.
Yeah, no, I think those are great examples. And I wanted to touch on quickly, I know we got off Apple, but I do have to ask you what it was like to work there. What was your involvement? And just tell me the story. I'm dying to know what that looked like in that.
I never worked at Apple. I worked at an agency called Regis McKenna for part of the time that I worked with Steve Jobs. It was a great PR firm. And then I built my own PR agency and I continued to work with Steve there. So I was never an employee of Apple, but I did work very, very closely with him. And
Gotcha.
What it was very difficult and challenging, but he was so visionary and so incredibly good at stretching people beyond their limits of what even they thought they could do, that you'd go home every night having done something you never did before in your life, thinking, wow, I did that. And Steve's the one who made it possible for me to do that. So I feel like I've gained so much knowledge and understanding of my profession, if you will, because of working for Steve than I ever would have otherwise. But it was tough. He was a tough critic.
I'm sure. So do you have any examples of work that you did during that time period, or anything that we would recognize or would feel familiar to us?
Well, the big things that I did was I did launch the Macintosh, and I remember, just a couple of things about that. I remember one time he was interviewing some more people to work on the Macintosh team. This was before the launch of it. And I said to him, Steve, how do you pick a person? Because he only wanted 100 people on this team. Mm-hmm. So it was a very small group of people. And I said, how do you pick these people? And he said, well, here's what I do. I sit them down at a table with the Macintosh facing them. Now remember, this thing hadn't been launched yet. So mm-hmm. the Mac is facing them. I sit opposite them at the table, and I basically just watch them. I watch what they do. I watch and see if they're able to, begin to engage with the computer. How do they engage with the computer? And then I watch, once they do that, what is going on with their eyes. And if there's a sparkle in their eyes, then I know they're right for my team.
Wow.
And I just think it was a fascinating way to hire people. It's it's really a very interesting approach, which he always had. And Steve only said thank you to me maybe 3 or 4 times in our entire time of working together. But one of those times was backstage after the Macintosh launch. So the thing happened at De Anza Center in Cupertino, California. It was a huge media success. It was not however, so much of a product success. We can talk about that in a little bit. Mm-hmm. But that day was a giant success. And after it was all over with, we were kind of hanging out backstage, and he came over to me and he said, thank you. And that was just a very, those little moments when he said something like that positive to you, they meant so much more than the normal thank you that everybody else gives you all the time. It was quite a crazy time.
Yeah, unbelievable. So when you said that it was a great media success, but not so much product, was it that they weren't flying off the shelves? It was getting a lot of hype and
yeah. So Sherry, we actually made a mistake. All of us, Apple, Steve, John Scully, Regis, me, we all made a big mistake. Steve really wanted to push out the IBM PCs that had been kind of placed in most of the companies at that time. So there really weren't very many personal computers out there. Apple had done the first with the Apple I and then the Apple II, but then IBM introduced their PC, and they basically penetrated the business market with that PC. And there were PCs wherever there was a PC in business, and that wasn't everywhere, but wherever there was one, it was an IBM. And Steve's goal was to push out those IBMs and replace them all with Macintoshes. And what happened is we ended up trying to position the computer as a business computer. And coming out the chute, it really wasn't that. It didn't have the right things you needed to be a business computer. Didn't have cursor keys, didn't have a printer, didn't have a network, didn't have anything other than that cute little box. So once we launched it, what we realized is it wasn't flying off the shelves, and businesses weren't buying it. They already had their IBM PCs, and they weren't interested in trying the Mac, even though we did a great advertising program called Test Drive a Macintosh, which I thought was really clever. But anyway, it wasn't selling. So what we had to do was everybody kind of regrouped and said, okay, what is going on with the Macintosh? And what we discovered, and this was really Steve's brilliance, he realized, oh my gosh, there's a cult forming around this computer. And maybe that's what we ought to focus on, is that cult. Not so much the businesses, but let's focus on the people who are actually magnetically attracted and want to build a relationship with their Macintosh. That's what we found. And those happen to be the creative people. And so what started to happen is the creative people started bringing in the Macintosh to their businesses through the back door. And then we began to market to those people and to begin to grow that cult that ultimately turned into the Think Different campaign that was done for Apple. But that's really what happened. It was a mistake, but Steve was so brilliant to see what was good that was going on, and this cult that was forming around the computer was really a very positive thing that we could all play on and then get that computer into a successful place in the market. And a year later, it began to do much, much better.
Yeah, that's amazing. Do you think there was anything ahead of time that you would have been able to see that? Or was it one of those things that you just needed to let the chips fall and then analyze from there?
Yeah, I mean, Steve was never one for market research, and I don't know that traditional market research would actually have netted any information about this. The one thing we probably did know is that the computer had already formed a cult within the people at Apple and anybody else who had seen it, and it was very closely guarded as an industry trade secret. I mean, I had one on my desk at Regis McKenna, but it was covered up with a blanket all day long because we didn't want to see it. So we kind of, if we'd really been paying attention, we would have noticed, oh my gosh, there really is a cult forming around this thing. But we weren't. We were so focused on, let's get this into businesses. After all, we're all business people. We love using it. Why wouldn't everybody else want to use it? Well, that's when we discovered that a lot of people didn't want the Macintosh experience. They wanted the IBM experience or the DOS experience at the time. So no, I don't. Other than that, I don't think. When you're trying to change the world, sometimes you just have to throw it against the wall and see what sticks. But the important part of that throwing it against the wall and seeing what sticks exercise is it's seeing what sticks. Yeah. And it may not be the thing you thought it was. And a lot of people miss the thing that sticks because it turns out to be something they didn't think it would be. Like in the case of the Macintosh, it was the cult. So you have to really pay close attention to what's sticking.
And making sure that you pivot accordingly. I think
Yes.
so often it's so hard to know whether you just keep trying. Well, it was just launched. We just need to give it a couple more months. We just need to give it another year instead of,
how much do you give it? Right. The question is,
Yeah.
how much time do you give it? It's and the other thing that's important about these kinds of revolutionary products is you need a financial cushion to pull them off, because they often don't succeed in the very first, outreach. So if Macintosh hadn't had the Apple II underneath it to support its failure over the first several months, it never would have made it to the marketplace. So when people want to change the world, it's really important to do it with a financial cushion, either with a previous product that was successful or so much funding that you can actually afford to fail for a few months till you figure it out, because nothing works the first time exactly the way you think it's going to.
Right, for sure. So what are some of the most common questions that you hear working, day to day in your firm? What are things that seem to come up time and again from companies?
Well, I think companies are really interested in understanding what do they need to say about their product or service that is going to get people to write about it if they happen to be a journalist, or talk about it if it's a podcast, or buy it if it's a customer. And that's a tough question, because they think they've already built the most beautiful thing in the world, and so they come to communication people like me to help them say it the right way. And the issue is sometimes the product itself is not quite there yet. It hasn't achieved what we call product market fit yet. So creating language around that doesn't solve the problem. Getting a bunch of press coverage doesn't solve the problem. So making a company understand that the question of launching an innovation into the marketplace with stickiness is a multifaceted process involving more than just communication, more than just marketing. It has a lot to do with product, customer relationships, a financial cushion, all of these things.
Yeah. How do you know that you have a product with stickiness? Are there any signs that you know that you're headed in the right direction at least?
I think that there is, and it's one of those weird things. It's a little bit like pornography, It's very challenging to measure, but you know it when you see it. It's
That's funny.
kind of one of those things, and being super sensitive to that is really important in this process. So the marketing people and hopefully the CEO or the founder needs to be super sensitive to that. That it either is sticking or it isn't sticking, and then know when to jump in and make the changes if that's required, or give it more time if that's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And do you find yourself, are you offering that to companies, that if they come to you looking for more outreach, better copy, and do you send them back to the drawing board?
Yeah, I try to have a very honest discussion with people about their product or their service, and my company seeks to be a true partner with our clients, where we're not just the communication people, but we are using our communication skills to build a better company, build a better product or service for them. So we want to be sitting at the table, where the decisions are being made. We want to contribute to those discussions so that the communication point of view can be a mix in the decision-making process. And so we only work with companies who allow us to do that. And Steve allowed us to do that, and I figure if it's good enough for Steve, it should be good enough for everybody, but that's not always the case. A lot of companies are very structured in a very segmented way, and if you're going to be doing communication strategy, they want you to be talking to the PR department only. And that's just not the way that my firm operates, because what you need at the table is people with many different skills, communication being one of them, so that the right decisions get made at the right time. And then when it's time to execute those decisions, then, my team can do the communication execution. But we can't just come in and start at the execution level. There has to be time spent on the strategy in order to make the whole thing work, which is why this whole positioning thing in my book, in Get to Aha, is so important. We talked a lot about the core DNA, which is only one of the 6 things you have to do to get to a great position, but there are 5 other things as well that need to be brought to the table with the C-suite and discussed, because they're very important things that have to do with the strategy of the company.
Yeah. Would you like to touch on those a little bit? Or we can
Yes.
also tell people to go buy the book instead, but I don't want to give it all away.
Sure. Well, I definitely want people to buy the book, but sure, there are 6 C's. So core DNA is the first one. We call that the core, and then there is the category that you're in. And in the world of technology, deciding whether or not to form a new category, join a category, or redefine a category is a huge strategic decision that must be done at the C-suite level. So there's core, there's category, there's community. Who are you serving with this product or service? And not only who is the potential customer, but who are all the people who influence the customer, and how do you reach them, and how do you get into their heads so that they become a supporter of your product or service. So there's core, there's category, there's community, there is competition. It's super important to understand exactly how the competition is talking about themselves, and it's also important to understand that people who seem like they might be competitors might not be your real competitors. There are other competitors that are lurking in the shadows, and you need to understand who those are. So a real examination of your competitors and your potential competitors is critical. And then there's another C that we call context, which is the timing in which you are launching something into the market is very important to its positioning. So in today's world, if you're launching a software product, you have to launch it in the cloud. There's nobody anymore who can launch any kind of software product that is not a cloud-based system, because that's the context we're living in. So we look at core, we look at category, we look at community, we look at competition, we look at context, and the final C is what we call criteria, which is before we even embark upon this whole exercise of positioning, let's write down the criteria for a successful positioning statement. It must have this, it must do that, it must accomplish this. And then so that we have that after we've done the exercise, we can go back to it and say, yes, we hit 3 of the 4, we're in good shape, or we hit 5 of the 7, we're in good shape. So really, those 6 C's are really how you do great positioning, but it's got to start with understanding what your DNA is.
Yeah, I think those are hugely helpful. One of the questions when you mention competition, you say you need to make sure that you know how the competition is talking about themselves. Do you take that information, and this probably varies case to case, but should you be taking that information to help differentiate yourselves, or are you able to look and say, well, this is working, maybe we'll recreate a piece of that? What's your advice typically when you're looking at that information about what your competitors are doing?
That's a great question, because this is why communication people have to sit at the strategic table, because sometimes you have to affect how the product is being developed in order to be differentiated. And if you're not sitting at that table, you're never going to be part of that discussion, and then that will be missed. So, technology kind of moves in waves. There's a lot of people doing the same thing at any given time, right? There's a lot of people building machine learning stuff right now. There's a lot of Fitbit-like products, a lot of smart watches. Whenever things like that happen, there's a cluster of these products that all look and feel exactly the same. So it's really important to have a differentiator there and to build it into the product if you can. And then once you've built it into the product, then you have something to talk about. But you need to understand what everybody else is saying and doing with their product before you begin that process. So it's quite a thorough thing. You don't just go off into the lab and say, gee, I'm going to build the next better Fitbit. You got to really understand what that means.
Yeah, and that's a good point as well, because I think oftentimes we say, well, our product's similar, but we're going to market it differently, or we're going to talk about it differently, or we're going to present it differently. But if the core product or service is not different, your customer is going to understand that. And then it does just come down to, okay, if I'm comparing 2 different products, which one's cheaper? I don't really care about their messaging. I'm going to look at maybe customer service and price, essentially.
Well, this is what Lyft and Uber, this is what's going on with Lyft and Uber right now. There's no difference between those services whatsoever. When you get right down to it, it's the same service. But what Lyft has decided to do is market itself as a mother. So it's looking to its DNA and capitalizing on its customer-friendly DNA to use that as its marketplace differentiator, where Uber is not looking to its because they don't have it. They don't have that DNA. They've got more product-oriented DNA. So the only thing that they can look to combat against Lyft is building a better product. And frankly, every time I go to use an Uber, it's getting worse and worse and worse, frankly.
Wow.
So anyway,
Wow.
you can use your DNA as your sole differentiator if it's true to who you are, like Lyft does.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's helpful, and that's a good clarification for sure. So do you have any examples of someone that's read the book or someone that you've worked with your firm that you feel like you've really been able to help someone? You've really been able to help them pivot or shift or reach that tipping point to get to the next level of their business?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this story is in the book, but I want to say because it's just kind of a cute one. We worked with a company called Building Connected. Building Connected is a bid management software tool for the construction industry.
Okay.
So and the guys who founded, and they're all guys, the guys who founded the company and work there are all ex-construction guys. So they are all burly, testosterone-laced men. So we went in to do their positioning work, and of course they saw themselves as building the best product on the planet, right? They were really more. They wanted themselves to be mechanics in my methodology because they were men and they saw themselves as mechanics. We spent about an hour and a half with them, and then one of them the CEO, I think, got a call from a customer who was having an issue with the product. And what happened at that point made it clear to us that these were not mechanics, they were actually mothers. So the guy gets the call, and he takes the call, and first of all, he took the call, and then he hangs up the phone afterwards, and he looks over to his team, and he goes, XYZ customer's got an issue with this, we got to go deal with it right now. They all jumped up, they all ran out of the room, and they were gone for like 30, 40 minutes while they dealt with this problem, and then they came back, and we said, you know what, guys, I know you don't like this, but you're not mechanics, you're mothers.
That's so funny.
It changed their life. The story's in the book. They now do everything through the lens of customer satisfaction and customer friendliness, and they are proud to be a bunch of mothers.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great example and something that it's why it's so helpful to have an outside person looking at your company as well. That as much feedback as you can get, as much outsider perspective as you can get, because they might not have come to that conclusion on their own, but you were able to see that firsthand and seeing how the company worked.
Yes. It's looking at behavior. That's how you can tell a lot of things about a company.
Yeah,
and
for sure. Yes, that's true. So other than your own book, which we will definitely link to, but do you have any other recommendations for our listeners, whether maybe it's like an app that you always use on your phone or a book that you read that you felt like really gave you some insight? Do you have any recommendations for us?
Yeah, there's 3 books that I can I say 3?
Yeah, absolutely.
So they're all business books, but the first one I want to call out is called Positioning. It's the first and only other book besides mine ever written on the topic of positioning. It was written by Jack Trout and Al Reese, and it is a great first look at how you do positioning. And it was done before the internet, so lots has changed since then. But I highly recommend that as a basic understanding of the concept of positioning, which is essentially how do you own a piece of real estate in a customer's head. So Positioning is the first book I would recommend. The second book I would recommend.
Before you dive into that, I'm going to interrupt you and ask, why do you think there haven't been many books written on this topic?
I think that's a really great question. It is such an important part of marketing. I think a lot of people mush it into the branding exercise, and it just becomes a very small thing when they're doing a branding thing. But it's not a small thing. It's a giant thing. It's like the nucleus of the cell. It may be very tiny, but without it, you got no cell.
Right.
So I think that it's been not brushed aside, but it's been incorporated into an exercise that usually has to do with building a logo or a design or an ad campaign or something like that. And it's usually not thorough enough or rigorous enough in those settings. So that's why I really like for people to understand what was written in the 70s. And by the way, that book is still a bestseller in business. So it's not like that book went away. That book is still a huge bestseller. And I
do think even though it was written before a lot of the digital stuff, I think that can be so valuable. And I do believe that the pendulum tends to swing back and forth and that we're heavy into tech, but some of that traditional view on things could really change your perspective in a more helpful way instead of reading all of the articles that have come, like the current articles. I feel like a lot of it's the same kind of stuff. And if you can jump back to the 70s, is that when you said it was written?
Yep.
You might get some gems that I might not have thought of otherwise.
Exactly. I mean, humans have behaved the way we behave for eons, right? The internet may change how we do things, but our basic fundamental behavior is the same. And what they talk about in their book, and what you're trying to do when you read my book, is really, how do you get that real estate in a customer's head? How do you own that spot in somebody's head so that they think of you, they remember you, they come back to you, and ultimately they buy your product? Because that's what we're all trying to do, is sell more stuff, right?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, sorry, I had to interrupt you quick, but what's number 2?
Okay, the number 2 book is a book called Blue Ocean Strategy, and I cannot recall the authors of it, but it is a great book about strategy, which is a super important thing to have at the core of any table of senior leaders talking about building a company or launching a product or whatever. And it's a good book about, it's about finding that empty space, finding that real estate. They call it blue ocean, but finding the space in the blue ocean where your company can exist uniquely and in a differentiated way. And so if you understand that book, then you can kind of understand the strategy that needs to happen before you do positioning. And then the third book that I recommend is a book called Organizing Genius. And it's basically a book of case studies of a number of teams that have come together and done magical things. And how did that happen? The Manhattan Project is in there. The Macintosh is in there. I think even the Beatles might be in there. I'm not sure about that. But at any rate, it's a great book about how great teams of people come together, and how did they come together, and then what do they do when they are together? What's the culture of those teams? How do they behave with each other? And how do they basically create magic? So those are the 3 that I really like.
Yeah, no, they sound like great ones. I'm going to go add them probably to my Amazon wish list. They're on there.
Great.
But the Organizing Genius too, I love getting to read stuff like that, the case studies, the nitty-gritty, like as opposed to maybe best practices. The more practical and the more just information I can get, and the stories can be so helpful along the way that I might not need to recreate what they did. I might not, probably am not capable of recreating what they did, but I might get something out of it that might spark a new idea for myself. And I love reading those kind of things for sure. So
we all learn best from other people, and the only way we have of getting that information is through their stories. So storytelling is a critical part of the human condition.
It is for sure. Well, I appreciate you chatting with me. How can people find you if they want to connect with you on social media or find your website?
Sure. Well, I'm on LinkedIn as Andy Cunningham. I'm also, my website, I have 2 websites. I have a CunninghamCollective.com website, which can be reached through CunninghamCollective.com or gettoaha.com, GET2AHA.com. I also have my own personal website, AndyCunningham.com, and then my Twitter handle is AndyCunningham4.
Perfect. I love it. And we'll make sure that we link all of that in the show notes as well on our website. And do you have any final thoughts for us? Any big words of wisdom? I know we covered a lot, but maybe something that you carry with you on a regular basis.
Well, I think, that's a great question. For me, I think strategy is just the most important thing that you can do when you're a marketing person. So this is really a message to marketing people. It's not so much about getting press coverage or getting sales. You really need to understand how that is going to happen, and so that you can replicate it later on. And that's really comes at the strategy level. And if your expertise happens to be marketing or it happens to be communication, get yourself at the strategy table so that perspective is part of the larger perspective of the company.
Mm-hmm. I think that's great advice. And something that I try to do myself. It's something that I love that piece of it. And I agree with you that the positioning and the strategy piece of it does need to permeate everything else. You could get a fluke, you can get a lot of publicity, but like you said, if the product, the service, the strategy is not there, it's just not gonna survive.
Exactly. Can I just tell one very quick short story about that whole thing, or what kind
Absolutely.
of why that strategy thing is so important to me?
Yeah.
I first came to Silicon Valley and I first started working on the Apple account with Steve Jobs. My boss was Regis McKenna, was the agency I was working for, and that was his agency. And I remember we were at one of the very first Apple meetings that I went to, and Steve was there, and John Scully was there, and all these other important people were there. And Regis dominated the whole meeting. He was there to introduce me to the team, but he basically dominated the whole meeting and, did his thing. And after the meeting, I said, Regis, I didn't think you positioned me very well in that meeting. And he looks at me and he goes, oh, no, you don't understand. I don't position you. You position you.
Yeah.
And it was just such a great life lesson because he was right. I let him talk. I let him dominate the meeting, and I should have jumped in and done my thing. And from that moment on, that's what I've been doing. That's what I've been doing ever since.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an important moment to remember for sure. And we don't need the invitation, that we can contribute and show up. Especially
we women.
Yep.
Jump in, lean in, do whatever it is you're going to do, but don't shut up.
For sure. I love it. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your stories and your insight with us, Andy. I loved getting to speak with you. And we'll keep in touch.
Thank you, Sherry. This was awesome. I look forward to hearing it later, but thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
That wraps things up for this episode, and wanted to remind you guys that you can always find show notes at pushpullsales.com. You can also connect with us on social media. We are at pushpullsales on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can reach out to us anytime if you have feedback or topic suggestions or want to be a guest on the show. You can simply email us, pushpullsales@gmail.com. You can also support our show at patreon.com/pushpullsales. Thank you to bensound.com for our intro and outro music. And thanks to you guys for listening. Tune in next time where we'll tackle another topic. See ya.